how would Peter revamp sprint races / sprint quali were he in charge?
I'd get rid of them completely. That's how I'd revamp them. I just wouldn't have them at all. What's the point? If you logically look at it, the driver of the day has to be Max Verstappen. Why wouldn't it be Max Verstappen? What did he do wrong? What did he do not to deserve the driver of the day award in China? I don't know, I'll list all the things that he didn't do. Okay, there's the list. Lewis, once he got that P2 in the sprint race, he kind of seemed to dial out of it, didn't he? I mean, it was a way of Lewis saying, show me some rain, show me some crosswind, show me some difficult things, and I'm right there. Give me a dry track where this car is not very good, and a quality driver like me is going to be struggling to get out of Q1.
At the next board meeting, Peter, should Mercedes be having conversations around succession plans, and should those potentially involve replacing one Toto Wolff? Hello and welcome to another iteration of the F1 Hour. I'm joined once again by the inimitable, my friend, your friend, the go-toest F1 minded in business, Mr. Peter de Windsor. How are you doing, sir?
I'm great, thanks, Cameron. How are you doing? Much more importantly.
I don't know about all that, Peter, but I'm good. I fancied touching base with you on the back of what was an eventful Chinese Grand Prix. Peter, I would pitch the first question to you this way. What do you think was the biggest story out the back of this weekend's automotive pugilism?
Well, in terms of results, I guess you got to say Lewis getting on the podium, albeit in the sprint race. I thought the FIA's attempts to help Lando as much as possible were amazing. I mean, first of all, giving him a pole and then taking it away and then giving him back a pole for the sprint race and then declaring him winner of the Grand Prix proper. That stood up for 4 or 5 minutes until they realized that they better actually make Max the winner. So, yeah, I mean, the FIA didn't have a lot of good points coming out of this weekend, I don't think. I think, a lot of it for me was the infighting between Carlos Sainz and Charles Leclerc, and what happened on that first corner of the first lap of the Grand Prix is going to be kind of setting the scene for the rest of the year, I think. And no surprise at all. You can't blame either driver because they're under different pressures, different situations, different stages of their careers. But if Carlos tries to pass Charles on the outside now, we know what's going to happen, and equally vice versa. So that's an interesting dynamic, definitely. And I guess the other ones, I don't know, you can go on and on, but I mean, I was a bit surprised at how Oscar Piastri didn't take a little bit more to Lando Norris, I guess. And then also, I don't know. I mean, the whole Mercedes situation was really put into perspective on Sunday in the race, wasn't it? Not good at all.
No, not good at all. Go on then. Let's talk to the FIA as a first order priority, because again, Peter, we've talked about viewership ad infinitum and the trajectory of F1 as Liberty Media continue to try and grow the sport. How disenfranchised watching were you, not knowing whether you can trust the metrics? Again, in the first instance, being told that Lewis had made it on pole for the sprint race, and then secondly, having a couple minutes worth of Lando Norris having won the Grand Prix. What are they doing here, Peter?
Well, Lando Norris, not only having won the Grand Prix, but all the data there showing that he'd won the Grand Prix, that he'd covered the distance at a shorter time than Perez or Max, who'd finished second and third for 5 minutes. I don't know. The FIA, for me, they look a bit scrappy at the moment, and there's quite a lot of things wrong in a number of areas, in my opinion. And I think we saw some of that on the surface in China. I don't think that's scratching the surface almost of really some of the issues there. And it's, as you say, one of the great moments is as they cross the line, who is on the pole, who's won the race. That's when the news agencies, that's when all the people who aren't really watching the race actually do pay attention, or qualifying, and to see what the result is. And if you don't get it right at that moment, you really do start to think of Abu Dhabi 21 again and all the things that should have been put right ever since then. And I don't know. For me, I mean, I think another point, though, having said all of that, is that I don't know what it was like for you, but in terms of the people watching the sprint race, there seemed to be remarkable lack of interest, in my opinion, from what I could see from my data anyway, and what I'm doing on YouTube. My coverage of untimed practice got more viewers than the coverage of the race, the sprint race, and possibly because it was at such a ridiculous hour. And if you're going to have a sprint race in order to spruce up the Grand Prix weekend and have more TV viewers and more viewers at the track and everything else, at least put it on at a time that's palatable for most of the world who are watching it on TV. But for the Europeans, and that's quite a large chunk of the audience, it was on at 4 a.m. or something. I mean, what's that all about?
Yeah, it was bonkers. I get why they've done it, right? Because you've got to, I suppose, as a first order priority, you've got to cater to the Chinese demographic, since, of course, it's the Chinese Grand Prix. But
well, if I can stop you there, I don't think you're right there. I mean, I think, well, let me disagree with that, because Bernie's philosophy always was the at-track audience, and you could call that the local audience as well, is the TV audience. It's not the significant audience that is actually paying the bills in Formula One. And so, we all know that the audience at the track in China is never going to be vast. Yes, of course, it was bigger this year than ever before, capacity, but we didn't actually see the number, because the number probably isn't very big compared with other Grand Prix. So, I don't think we should be catering for that. We should be catering for the hundreds of millions that are watching it globally and not necessarily locally.
Wow, it's a good shout. And probably as a proportion of the total revenue that F1's pulling in, the live gate, in accordance with what you just said, Peter, will be the lower portion of the whole, right?
Of course, absolutely. No doubt about that.
Blimey. Let's talk about Lando then. Because, again, very divisive a topic is Mr. Norris. Some saying that this is the coming of age. Andrew Benson writing an article on BBC that this is excellent what we're seeing from Lando Norris. Some saying that he was the benefit of safety car and Alonso and all these bots holding up the mid pack. Where do you sit on either side of that fence, Peter?
Well, I've got a soft spot for Lando, because he's always so depressing before a race, and I love that about him. And going into this Chinese Grand Prix, he actually said, "Oh, I don't think we'll go very well in China because there are too many long corners." And I did a live stream shortly after that quote came out saying, "I think Lando's going to be very pleasantly surprised. I'll be shocked if the McLaren's not quick at Shanghai." So, Lando, you owe me one. I was right. You were wrong. No, I mean, obviously, I think he does that for every race because he doesn't want to tempt fate, as it were. It's a very endearing quality of Lando. And he's an endearing guy. He's quite just simple's the wrong word, but he's very uncluttered in the way he lives his life, I think, and the way he lives his racing life. And yeah, he drove beautifully at the weekend. Great call to go onto that one-stop strategy. And the most interesting thing there was that Ferrari obviously did the same thing with Charles Leclerc, and they tried it with Carlos, but he was out of sync already, to be honest, with the way he'd used his tires, or had to use the tires after that first lap skirmish. But they tried it with Charles, and unlike previous races, Ferrari couldn't match McLaren on that same strategy. And that's what obviously Charles was thinking. Well, this is what brought me back into the race, and wherever, and Japan, and it didn't work in China. And so the McLaren was a better car around China than the Ferrari. So instead, in terms of saying, "Oh, this is the coming of age of Lando Norris," I think that's a bit over the top. I think he came of age a while ago, and McLaren did a very good job of getting the setup more or less right in the 1 hour that we had before the sprint qualifying, whereas Ferrari came to Shanghai with not a very good setup, and they didn't really get it right in that hour, and they paid the penalty for the rest of the weekend. The same probably applies to Mercedes a little bit. Aston Martin did a pretty good job of getting it right. But going back to the point, McLaren had a pretty good car in China, and Lando virtually maximized it. As I said, my only criticism of Lando ever is that with all that talent and all that softness of touch, and I love that response when they told him to use engine braking, and he said, "No, thank you." And that just sums up Lando. He's not an engine braking sort of guy. He's a finessey guy, and that's great. But I just wish he'd use and channel a little bit more of that finesse into having to use a little bit less road into and out of corners, and just getting the car a little bit straighter and going into sort of walking into Max territory, because he's got the natural feel and touch to be able to do that. I don't know whether I don't know if it's because he's never thought about it or nobody's ever telling him to do that. But if he did, he would definitely find more pace, and you definitely have more margin in which to operate, which is a great thing to have if the car's not as good as it was in China.
It's a good shout, Mr. Windsor. However, I think the criticism of Lando that people will leverage and continue to leverage at him, even on the back of that performance, is that sometimes in the heat of battle, youthful exuberance gets the better of him, right? Clouds his otherwise clear mentality. As an example, turn one in the sprint shootout when he's tried to go around the outside of Lewis, 7-time champion, and ended up losing a couple of places for that. And even, I mean, I understand what you're saying on the engine braking piece, but in terms of his tone, like the kind of cheeky, chappy way that he communicates with his guys, again, for me, it was reminiscent of Sochi 2021, right? I feel like he needs to work more with his guys than against them, and a little bit less banter maybe might help him. I don't know, Peter, freestyle.
Yeah, it's difficult to judge on the banter thing because a lot of that is when he knows the cameras are on him. And I don't think he's like that. And the Lando I don't know him very well at all, but the Lando I've watched, and I've watched him quite a lot, is pretty serious in the garage and pretty focused. And there's not a lot of that, chappy banter going on. And as for the turn one thing, as we saw with other drivers, you can do that. That's one place where you can do that. I think the only mistake he made was to make a bad start, to be honest. And he was so annoyed and so irritated that he'd lost the lead going into turn one that I don't think it was that big a shout for him to say, right, I'm going to stay on the outside here, because it's a doable thing. We've seen it happen many times. I mean, Daniel Kvyat, I think, pulled off one of the passes of the decade, didn't he, going in there when he was driving for Toro Rosso at one point? Yeah. And you can pass 2 or 3 cars on the outside. If the cars on the inside are nicely spaced and allow you to get back in when you need to, it's a great place to be. So I don't really hold that against Lando. I think it was just a function of making a bad start. So if you want to criticize him, you say, well, he's on the pole, he's got the clean side of the grid. Why did he make a bad start? Yeah. And that's a good question. And then I'm thinking, do McLaren historically make good or bad starts? And I'm thinking, I don't really know. I think it's probably about average. Yeah. Ferrari made bad starts, didn't they, in the Grand Prix? And they normally are jackrabbits off the line.
Yeah.
So it was a bit iffy off the line there, but that's to give him the benefit of the doubt. But I suppose if you want to give him the doubt, you'd say, well, Lando, you're on the pole. Let's focus and make sure we make a perfect start here. That's what he'll do next time, I'm sure, in that situation.
I think that's a good shout. Although I think you said this in one of our chats previously, Peter, that it's a shame that drivers in 2024 they're not flexible when it comes to attacking. So it looks like, I mean, if it's round the outside of Danny Rick, then into turn one, then okay, take that to the bank, right? It's a no-brainer. But 7-time champion Lewis Hamilton, even in a dodgy car, it's a low probability move around the long radius.
Again, I'm not. Yeah, I mean, the counter to that is actually Lewis is one of the cleanest drivers in the history of the sport. So if you're going to do that, I would have thought you'd feel pretty confident that the one thing Lewis isn't going to do is squeeze me out. And Lewis didn't squeeze him out. He just ran out of grip. That wasn't Lewis just using all the road. So I think, on the contrary, the fact that it's Lewis is what. You'd think about it for a millisecond, as everything's in milliseconds, but you'd think, oh, it's Lewis. Okay, I'm going to be on the outside here, see what happens. And then your only thing you need to be doing is making sure you've got the grip level you need. And obviously at some point mid-corner, he just ran out of it. But if it was, say, Leclerc on the pole, I think that's when you'd say, this guy's he's certainly going to use all the road. You'd have to assume that. If it was Fernando, you'd have to assume he's going to use all the road. But with Lewis, no, I think on the contrary, I think you'd say, no, this is Lewis. He ain't going to do anything, dirty.
I can have a go there. And speaking of Fernando, Peter, I heard you talk to the moment when he did what Carlos Sainz failed to do in qualifying, which was obviously to correct on the exit of turn 16. Talk to that as you ingested it, Peter, and talk to the fact that split second later, Fernando Alonso was straight back on the bloody DRS as if nothing had happened. Incredible, right?
Yeah, I mean, everything was cat-like, and unbelievable to watch. And I'd love to see that in a super, super, super slow-mo and to see the handwork at that moment. It's very difficult to say, oh, Fernando held the moment and Carlos didn't, because that moment for Carlos began at the point of turn into the corner, as it did for Fernando. And as I've always said, Fernando's got a rather spiky initial turn in, but once he's got the car slightly unsettled, he's then very, very good at getting all four tires to sit as squarely to the road as he possibly can. And he's really good at mid-corner rotation. And so by the time he's heading from his rotation point to the exit point, he's got quite a square car to the road. And if he's got it slightly wrong and he's just going a little bit too quick and he knows he's going to run out of road, he's going to do that with a car that's slightly squarer to the exit than Carlos Sainz, who's coming in on a wider approach. He's getting on the power as soon as possible. And when he's reaching the point where he's thinking, whoa, I'm run out of road here, he's got more load, more lateral load on the car, more angle on the car. Angle is the right word. He's got more angle on the car. And it's a more difficult car then to control. So we shouldn't, I mean, all I'm saying is it's not a question of just reflexes on the gravel. It's the way they take the entire corner that needs to be taken into account. And as I've always said, Carlos is one of the last of the great long corner drivers, and he's classic to watch when he's got it right. And he's been in a groove, a pretty good groove, China aside, for the last 18 months in that sense. He's just found the right level in which to operate. And the sort of mistake we saw isn't one that's characteristic of him in recent times, but it was the sort of thing that he used to do. So let's hope the fact that he got back to the pits, they repaired it that quickly, and then he went out and he almost went as quick as Charles Leclerc, shows that he's got a very, very strong mental approach now, and he knows exactly what he needs to be doing. And that was just an aberration almost. So yeah, I mean, I don't think you should really compare that with Carlos. I think you should just take the Fernando thing in its own little world of brilliance and dazzlingly fast balance and reflexes in combination, and how well he did that. And what we didn't see, of course, was the footwork and how perfect he would have been in the way he came out of the throttle the moment he was putting on that correction as well. And he had exactly the right of throttle at that moment. He wouldn't have come right out of it, that's for sure. And he just did everything perfectly. And so the car then comes back onto the track and it's dead straight. Yeah, DRS, here we go. And with Carlos, and to his credit, once he'd lost it, he then did a very good job of minimizing the damage of the car against the fence. And then he did a very good job of getting it back to the pits. And I don't know if we're going to talk about it, but I'm going to raise the point. I think it was very churlish of Aston Martin then to issue a protest about that on minutiae of fine print about whether you're allowed to do that. Because what Ferrari and Carlos did then was one of the great things about Formula One. To be able to recover that quickly and get out and do that lap time, I thought was staggering.
Absolutely, Peter. Testament. That's F1, right? That's F1.
Well, it's F1. And I wonder whether Aston Martin would have protested had Fernando not been passed by Carlos around the outside of turn 7 in the sprint race.
It's a very good
I'm not saying Fernando initiated that, but I suspect Fernando was in a position. I'd be surprised if he wasn't in a position to say to Lawrence Stroll or whoever, Andy Stevens, to say, don't do this. It's not right. Don't do it. Okay. I'm surprised. I'm pretty sure Fernando's in a strong enough position in the team to be able to say something like that when it comes to a sporting rules protest. But they went ahead with it. And I thought, that's churlish. And they were in front of him on the grid anyway. I mean, what the hell? What's it all about?
Yeah, it's a bit, but not necessarily in the spirit of the Fernando Alonso that we know and love.
Well, be careful about blaming Fernando for that, because it may not have been him. He may have been saying, don't do it. And Lawrence Stroll, or whoever, may have been saying, yes, we're going to do it. I've no idea. And I don't want to make any assumptions that I can't make. So, but all I'm thinking is I suspect Fernando had the ability to stop it happening, I think.
Fair. What did you make of Fernando Alonso's drive? In fact, let me ask you the question this way, Peter. Driver of the Day is another source of enthusiastic discourse in the community between, of course, the choices, the obvious ones: Lando, Lewis, some say, and Fernando Alonso. Who did you have down as your driver of the day?
I never really think about that driver of the day thing very much, because if you logically look at it, the driver of the day has to be Max Verstappen. Why wouldn't it be Max Verstappen? What did he do wrong? What did he do not to deserve the driver of the day award in China? I don't know. No. I'll list all the things that he didn't do. Okay, there's the list. He was perfect. So how could you not give it to Max? And to underline that, Sergio Perez didn't finish second. So it wasn't as if he had the best car by a million miles an hour. He did a perfect job all weekend. So there you go. Beyond that, Lando drove extremely well on that strategy. Charles Leclerc probably drove really well. We don't know how difficult that Ferrari was to drive, but probably really difficult to drive, I imagine. Perez, didn't do a great job all weekend. He was there or thereabouts, but got tangled up, didn't he? Fernando, well, how do you quantify a driver of the day? Is it a driver who's so quick in the early laps that he's up to second place when he shouldn't really be there, but he abuses his tires and ruins his race as a result? Is that worthy of a driver of the day award? It depends on how you look at it. They might as well have several awards. The guy that does the best job in the best car, the guy that does the best job of managing tires, the guy that does the best job of abusing tires and gets a great result as a result, because of the abuse. You could go down all this thing. So it's a bit juvenile, I think, to say this whole driver of the day thing.
Yeah, the categories are a bit crazy. Go on then, Peter. Talk to me about Ferrari, because it felt like, when we were speaking offline, it felt like a weekend of bubbling acrimony between teammates. George and Lewis and Carlos and Charles in particular even on track. How did you characterise their coming together, both in the sprint and the race? Who done it, Peter? Who was to blame for both of those?
Well, I don't think either driver, any of the four drivers you've mentioned would say, there's acrimony between me and my teammate. It's just the situations and the circumstances that evolve over the course of a weekend. And these days when it's very technical and there's so much telemetry and data that it's relatively normal for the two team cars to qualify very closely to one another. You're always going to have problems if there isn't complete harmony in the team. And complete harmony includes the knowledge that one driver has a superior status to the other. And that isn't the case at Mercedes or Ferrari. And there's all hidden undercurrents of stress in both teams. In the case of Mercedes, it's Lewis never wanted George in the other car anyway. There's still the hangover of Abu Dhabi 21, the hangover of the car being a dog. And Lewis now is quite relaxed, doesn't really care what happens because he's going to Ferrari next year and he's got a whole new career to look forward to. And then there's George, who wants to assert himself as the new number one favored driver at Mercedes for the next 50 years. And it's important for him, therefore, always to out-qualify and out-race Lewis. So you've got all that going on. And Mercedes not wanting to issue team orders, and behind the scenes, the Lewis fans wondering every time Lewis is slower whether or not he's getting the same treatment as George and all the usual stuff that builds up. And then on the other side, you've got Ferrari, where you've got Charles Leclerc, who's trying not to think about Carlos Sainz anymore because he's not an issue and he's just trying to focus on what he does. But annoyingly, every time he gets in the car, Carlos Sainz seems to be right there with him in terms of pace, and sometimes on the bit of road that he wants to use, and he can't do much about it. And then you've got Carlos, whose career is absolutely in the melting pot, has no idea what he's going to be doing in 2025, let alone beyond that, who's trying to show that he's worthy of a number one drive in a really good team. And along the way, he's driving better than he's ever driven. That shunt in qualifying aside. And even then, you got to say he drove really well to do that lap time immediately afterwards. So all of that adds up to, this is my bit of road. No, this is my bit of road. And lots of focus on how the team are trying to manage all those dynamics, whether it be Freddie Vasseur, whether it be Toto Wolff. Lots going on, lots for people to talk about. Not much you can do about it at all in any situation except sit back and either enjoy it or think, what a mess, depending on where your side of the fence is. And For me, Lewis, once he got that P2 in the sprint race, he kind of seemed to dial out of it, didn't he? I mean, it was a way of Lewis saying, show me some rain, show me some crosswind, show me some difficult things, and I'm right there. Give me a dry track where this car is not very good, and a quality driver like me is going to be struggling to get out of Q1. That's basically what Lewis's weekend was all about. And there was George white knuckle in every session. Yeah, he did a reasonable job in qualifying, I suppose, compared with Lewis. But yeah, he was struggling to be as quick as an Aston Martin, wasn't he? Or a second. He was struggling to beat Oscar Piastri, who had massive damage from a collision at the rear halfway through the race. So that doesn't put Mercedes in very good position. And as for Ferrari, I don't know. If I'd been running that team, could you have said to Charles Leclerc, if Carlos is outside you in turn one, make sure you give him room? I'm not sure you could say that anymore, because Charles would just say, why, what for? And I think that's probably what happened, isn't it? That you can't speak to the drivers anymore at Ferrari about how they should behave on track, because the damage is done now. They've fired Sainz and he's still super quick. And that's a ridiculous situation in which to have found themselves.
Absolutely. This is the tale of the imminently departing drivers, isn't it? And again, there's going to be agency and a sense of these guys are on gardening leave in effect. Why do they need to continue to foster rapport internally with their engineer or the guys with whom they know they won't be working next year? It's a difficult one to manage, and I know you've said in there that there's literally nothing that you can do. In your time, again, working with Frank and Nigel, did you ever have something similar come to pass where you kind of had to be a bit tippy-toey?
Yeah, we had it all the time. We had Frank promising one driver one thing and another driver the same thing, and having to deal with that. And we certainly had to deal with it with Nigel and Keke, and then Nigel and Nelson Piquet. And again, there's not much he could do, because the contract Piquet had was to be number one driver, which meant he had the spare car, he had the best Honda engine, he had the first use of any new part that came out of the factory. And Nigel he wasn't number two driver, but he was just a driver. And every time Nigel went quicker, Nelson complained to Patrick or Frank about whether it was the chassis or the engine or whatever. And there's nothing that anyone could do, because Williams were actually perfectly executing their contract with Nelson. It's just that he wasn't quite as quick as Nigel. And that's the problem. And that's a different problem, but there was nothing you could do, which is why there's so much acrimony, which is why Nelson then left the team in a huff and took Honda engines with him. Wow. So that is the situation. And to prevent all that, it needed to have been done well in advance. Either Ferrari deciding not to fire Carlos Sainz because he's doing a really good job and not go ahead with the whole Lewis thing, but they did. So that was it. Nothing you can do once you've made that decision. And in the case of the case of Mercedes, they needed to have done a much better job for Lewis from Abu Dhabi onwards. Better car, the right teammate, and look after him. And because of all the things that happened, no surprise. I'm surprised it took Lewis this long to leave, to be honest.
They're firefighting, aren't they, Peter? It's ridiculous. I do wish, like you've just alluded to, that Mercedes front-loaded some of these problems, not least of which their design philosophy, managing the hierarchy between the drivers. And because currently, and again, this is kind of the source of the discontent for many Lewis Hamilton fans around the world. Currently, it feels like not only they're firefighting, but they're mismanaging the PR. There's a famous tweet that they put out with a shot of a successful Mercedes car and the text, "If you don't love me at my worst, then you never deserve to love me at my best," which is kind of they're almost repelling further. They're making worse an already bad situation as far as their fan base and Lewis and fostering rapport. Do you think, Peter, let me ask you the question this way. Toto Wolff's a genius, a business mind extraordinaire for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But as at April 24, do you think that the Mercedes board should be having conversations around the succession plan for Mercedes going forward around around Toto being the team principal?
Yeah, I don't think it's to do with drivers, because he will say the succession plan is secure and we did really well to get George and now we've got Antonelli and all the rest of it. So it won't be drivers. You'd definitely, definitely Mercedes are open to criticism in terms of the engineering team and the way they've gone backwards ever since the 2022 regulations came into force, and their inability to improve at the rate of McLaren or Ferrari is, and to be embarrassed on a regular basis by Aston Martin, is something that really should be put under the microscope as to what they're not doing. Now, I'm sure if they were put under the microscope, if Toto was in the Mercedes board, he would say, well, okay, in that case, what do you think? What does everybody here think we should be doing? And they would say, well, we should have a better engineering team. Okay, well, who? And they would say, well, it's up to you, Toto. I said, well, exactly, it's up to me. And I think I've got the best people, which is what he would say. And then he would go on about possibly lack of correlation between the wind tunnel and reality, or other things that normally come up. All I can say is I've now sent 3 messages to Toto. Not that I'm anywhere on his totem pole of importance, and probably doesn't even open any messages from me, but I've sent him 3 messages on behalf of an extremely talented Formula One engineer who is available and has asked me to try to contact Toto to say he understands the situation with management and everything else, but he's quite happy to work as a consultant, but he's definitely got some good ideas as to where Mercedes should be going with the car and things that are not quite right with the car. And I haven't had a reply. And this may sound very arrogant, but racing isn't that complicated. It is about opening letters and sending replies, and it's about talking to people and being nice to people and using your brain in a logical way. And if you've got a blind spot, and you're just continuing to believe in a certain path of operation, and it's not giving you results over a 3-year period, surely you would open your mind a little bit more to some of the ideas of others. Surely that's what I would do in that situation. And I like to think, maybe I'm wrong, but I like to think that whenever I do get people take the trouble to email or write or whatever it is, or have done in the past, I've usually taken the trouble to reply. Sometimes a little bit late, but I try to. And it's because everybody likes Formula One. And if you're writing to somebody to say, look, I know a good guy, you should talk to this person, then you would imagine that there would be some sort of response, but nothing. So anyway, all I can say is that. And so therefore, I can't say any more than that, really, other than to say that kind of explains it all, doesn't it? As my dear friend Sheridan Thin used to say in Latin, res ipsa loquitur, which basically means that's it, nothing more to say, so be it.
Oh, Mr. Windsor, everything that you've just described to me, though, is in line with why people are getting increasingly cheesed off, right? Not taking your head above the parapet and managing relationships in real time, because ultimately, as you said on a gazillion occasions, Peter, F1 is a sport where success is a function of people, and so fail to manage those relationships is being destined to fail, right? In your
absolutely
endeavor.
Correct, Cameron. Engineering is about people. Yes, of course it's about engineering, but it's about the people who engineer, and it takes just as much time and trouble to manage, say, Adrian Newey, as it does to manage the drivers in your team or the race strategy. That's where Christian Horner has done such a good job over the years. I'm not particularly highlighting Adrian as a difficult guy. I'm just saying he's just one of 100 examples out there on the engineering side. They're all quite esoteric, focused people that need the best brought out in them. And I don't know, maybe they've got the right people at Mercedes, but they're not getting the best from them. And they're not mix and matching the different components and organizations as well as they should. I don't know. You wouldn't know until you got in there. But when you don't get a response to a message about a good engineer who does want to try and do something to help at Mercedes, then you think, well, that team is very, very closed in the way they think. And therefore, they're not going to be open to lateral thinking. And that's a problem in Formula One, in my view.
Yeah, just a bit, Peter. I think, you know what, it saddens me as far as Mercedes when you consider where they've come from, right? And kind of who they are becoming. I just wish that, I don't know, Peter. I get
Well,
it.
I mean, it's not. I mean, just you mentioned that tweet, and what they're basically saying is, don't be a Lewis Hamilton fan, be a Mercedes fan, because we've got a great future. But that's completely disregarding the way Mercedes and all the teams have allowed the Formula One fan base to grow globally over the last 15 years. They're the ones that have been on and on about the drivers and have given so much exposure to the drivers through the Netflix things and everything else that they've endorsed. And now to turn around and say, well, it's not about Lewis, it's really about that, the Mercedes badge and the silver arrows, and that's what all the fans should be supporting. I mean, it's too late to do that as well. They're the ones that created Lewis, so that's where they need to. The buck stops there.
It's disingenuous, isn't it, Peter? Double talking almost, and to put a bookend on that. The thing about Lewis is, I had an old boss / mentor that would always say, when somebody leaves the business, celebrate them, because if you fail to do that, the other people, your other direct reports, the other people who are working for you, will look at the way that you haven't celebrated that person's leaving and think about when they leave that theirs is going to be the same, right? That they're going to be disrespected equally. And I can't help but think about the guys and girls at Brackley and Brixworth. Inclusive of that is Lewis. All of a sudden, he's not being treated poorly, but not being managed and lauded and celebrated in the way that he was this time last year. And I think that's mismanagement of people, Peter.
I haven't watched it. I don't watch that aspect of Formula One close enough to agree or disagree with you about the about how it may have changed. But what I would say, and you make a good point, is that what Mercedes could be doing is they could be really playing up this being the last season of Lewis with Mercedes. And they could have the last season or something on the side of the car. They could be making it a really big thing. Let's celebrate Sir Lewis Hamilton, 7 times world champion, and make it a sort of validatory thing as he goes to all the circuits of the world in a Mercedes and really make it big. That's an interesting point, isn't it? And I hadn't thought of that. But I think that what a cool thing to do, what a positive thing to do. And what a nice way to make the public feel warm about everything Mercedes and the future.
Yeah,
it's a very good point, Cameron. And in reality, that's probably what should be done.
Celebrate him.
Rather than hide him away a little bit. I mean, if you look at the Mercedes put out more pictures. If there's a picture of a race, portfolio, there'll be more pictures of George than Lewis now, and that's an interesting thing, isn't it? Why?
Yeah, it doesn't bode well.
But I'm not sure it doesn't bode. It's just it's a missed opportunity. It's a bit like Formula One, the FIA saying to Andretti, "You need us more than we need you. Go away." When in reality, as I've said several times, what they should have been doing is saying, "Well, it's going to be impossible to get you in quickly because we've really got to get the teams to agree to it in terms of finances. They've all got to have compensation if they're going to let you in. But what we will do is we will work tightly with you in North America, raising money for you so you can link your name to Formula One over the next 3 to 4 years, and we can double the budget that you have and make it really mega when you do come in. Let's work closely together on this." That's a missed opportunity as well. That comes under the heading of, let's make a really big deal of this Mercedes Lewis Hamilton last season together. Let's at the British Grand Prix, let's have a celebration of Lewis and everything he's achieved at Mercedes. Let's do that.
Mercedes, if you need a consultant to look after your PR, then I know a guy, and his name is Peter de Windsor.
Well, it was your idea, Cameron. I think it's a great idea, that.
Superb stuff, Peter. Go on then. Finally, as we round third base, more than generous of your time as always, Peter.
No
Talk to me about Zhou Guanyu and the way in which he was celebrated, the homecoming of the Chinese star. And again, there were pictures being bandied around of him at the Shanghai International Circuit when he was a young pup, 10 years old or whatever. Talk to me about, do you think F1 needs to do more about celebrating drivers at their home track like they did Zhou Guanyu?
Yes, I do. And I think they did a very good job there. However, I've always got a however. I've been saying for years that we should allow the teams on a limited basis, on an allocated basis, defined in the beginning of the year, to run a third car periodically for a local driver who's good enough to be in the Grand Prix to help the promotion of that race. And I've said that for many years. And I've also said that Formula One as an industry should spend much more of its, a larger percentage of its money, some percentage of its money, because it doesn't spend any at all, on the development of young drivers in countries that are important to Formula One, potentially important in the future, like South Africa, India, South America, to get Brazil, to get more young drivers coming through in the future from those countries. And I include the United States there, because we've only got one on the grid at the moment. And so we should be doing that. And so, yeah, I mean, if Oliver Behrman, for example, was going to be racing a third Ferrari at the British Grand Prix, that'd be quite cool, wouldn't it? I'm not saying that Britain needs a big hand up, but let's talk about Monza and get another Italian on the grid, put Giovinazzi in a third Ferrari or whatever. You can find drivers in every country, I think, that would be capable of doing a half, they're not going to be in there doing anything. They wouldn't be eligible for points, but they could get in there and do it. And do anything to promote the local race, I think is very, very important. As I said in my video, I actually felt quite sorry for Yifei because I've always seen him as a driver, I got to say, as talented as Zhou Guanyu. But the one thing he didn't have was the money, whereas Zhou Guanyu did have the money behind him from day one to get right through the feeder system and to do what he does. Whereas I think Yifei, I think it's shame on Formula One that they didn't enable him to come into Formula One as well. And if he was there as a second Chinese driver, it would have been double the exposure, I think. And he's very talented, Yifei. I know he's doing world endurance now. So it's a good example of how if you'd gone to this other thing where Formula One, a percentage of everybody's budget had to go into, sorry, not budget, earnings had to go into the development of young drivers in countries important to Formula One. And maybe they're contracted to Liberty. I don't know, these drivers. It'd be a really good investment thing for Liberty to do as well. But to have these young drivers like Yifei who don't have the money, who should be in Formula One too. Yeah. And you and I could think of drivers in every country of the world that would be deserving of that. I mean, to me, it's absolutely ridiculous that we go to the Brazilian Grand Prix, and I guess it's going to be the same. We go to the Brazilian Grand Prix and Felipe Drugovich won't be racing in Brazil.
Oh my
it's
gosh,
ridiculous.
Peter.
I mean, this guy's got a massive amount of talent. And he's sitting there on the sidelines. As I said at the time, him signing a contract with Aston Martin to do nothing other than be seen in the garage is a complete and utter waste of money. And he's a good example of a guy that should be racing. Very good.
Yeah, you've nailed it there with Felipe.
And imagine what that would do to the Brazilian crowd if it was announced now that Drugovich was going to be racing in Brazil.
Humongous material uptick. Yeah.
Yeah. So again, they're scratching the surface of what is possible with all these local drivers, the national drivers who are important to their country. And yes, it was kind of nice how they acclaimed him at the end of the race. That was good. But we need much more of that, much more. And we need more Americans in Formula One as well.
100%. And it's not like there aren't drivers capable of rising to the top.
Of course there are. I mean, for every country, there's guys out there, given the right support and the right amount of finance. I mean, what's happened to Jehan Darubala? He's doing Formula E now. There's a really good Indian driver that could have been out there helping promote an Indian Grand Prix on the World Championship again and get him into a car.
100%. Yeah.
He's a quick driver, Darubala. Now, I'd say he's at least as quick as Zhou Guanyu.
No, absolutely. I think that's a good shout, Peter. And finally, mate, let me talk to you again. Something that's causing pause for thought in the community. I don't know if you've heard about the plans to extend the point scoring positions down to 12 from 10th. That now you're going to get a point for 12 potentially, and then 2 points for 11th. What do you think about that, Peter? Because a lot of people are saying that F1 is in danger, grave danger, of celebrating mediocrity.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that 100%. I think they should go the other way and take it back to 6th place. Stop there. They should never have changed it in the first place because it makes comparisons of points and championship seasons and everything completely meaningless. And what was there was no reason to do it. You can always have the results that affect the prize money for the teams and how much money they earn. which they don't talk about, of course, publicly. So what is the reason for having these points, too many points? And as you say, it'll celebrate mediocrity, and it detracts from great drivers of the past who finished 7th in their first Grand Prix and didn't get a point, and therefore they don't appear on the lists of history, and yet they've done a better job than some guy that finished 9th in their first Grand Prix and got 2 points. You know, it's pathetic. And I don't know why they do that. Well, it's just, I don't know, just change for change's sake, and none of that is good.
Yeah, it's no longer like for like across different seasons.
No, of course it's not. Of course it's not.
You've got to normalise and make adjustments. Let me just ask you a couple questions from some of my Elite Peddlers members. Kyori says, how would Peter revamp sprint races / sprint quali were he in charge?
Well, I'd get rid of them completely. That's how I'd revamp them. I just wouldn't have them at all. What's the point? I just think it devalues the Grand Prix. It's a potential for the guys that have done a very good job or could do a good job in the Grand Prix, potentially to have damaged cars. And as we can see from the popularity of sprints, they're not that great. So what is the point of the whole thing? I just don't get it. They should be enhancing qualifying and untimed practice much more along the lines that I've been suggesting for years, which is that they have we have a lot of really good access to the teams and drivers in terms of debriefs, in terms of what they're chatting about in the road cars to the track, the drivers' briefings, all that stuff is great TV. Obviously, it needs to be controlled and edited. We don't want any secrets coming out, but if a decent producer can do that without any problem at all, that's how we need to enhance it all, not by doing contrived things like sprint racing. Oof. Or reverse grid racing, even worse.
Oh, well, you're not a big fan of reverse. I know it's counter with my purist cap on. It's never going to wash, isn't it? But I'd love to see it, Peter, just as on a one-off to see how it pans out. I don't know. I think it would be. I think it'd be interesting.
Well, I think it pans out that Red Bull and Max are so on top of it, they're probably quite capable of qualifying 8th if they wanted to.
True. Very true. Go on then, Peter. Electronic asks, Adrian Newey has a rich and deep history with IndyCar. What lessons or learnings from Indy do you think Adrian has translated for F1 that none of his other F1 colleagues can emulate or replicate? Oof.
Well, Adrian's time at Indy was really before big-time electronics. That's not to say that Adrian isn't 100% on top of big-time electronics. Of course he is. I think Indy for Adrian gave him the finishing touch of race management and race organization and operating under pressure in the field, in the pit lane, and getting precise setups for the cars when there was a slight wind change or there was an ambient temperature drop of 3 degrees. I think that's what a lot of Indy is all about. I'm talking about Indy 500 now. And I think that is something that not all engineers have, but Adrian got that from a very early stage. So he was a very practical, hands-on engineer, if you like, long before he got to Williams and designed the FW14 with Patrick Head. And that's the engineer that went to Leighton House, went to March, and incredibly original and creative with the high nose and everything else. But he was also very good at operating the car in the pit lane. And that's one of the reasons Adrian is so good. And when Red Bull do have a setup problem and things aren't right, and even if Adrian's not at a race, you can be sure that they're on the phone to him. They're probably talking to him live anyway about setup, springs, roll bars, dampers, everything else. And I think that's what his time in America would have given Adrian.
Love a bit of Adrian Newey talk. Are you familiar with that Even Capelli story in the March 881, Peter, that he talks about in his book, How to Build a Car, where Prost says that he was following Capelli in that March 881 through a high-speed turn, and he was convinced that Capelli was going to put it into the barrier, that Prost, it looked like they all thought on the pit wall that Prost had an issue because he dropped back massively from Capelli, right? Only to find out when Prost got back in the pit that he just didn't believe that even Capelli wasn't going to have a massive incident, that there was no way he thought that Leighton House 881 could take that speed through that corner. Incredible.
Yeah, no, I was around then and watching it and blown away by how much grip they had. They were just phenomenal. He and Maurizio Gugelmin, and beautiful car, beautifully engineered. They didn't have great money and the budget wasn't there ready for development, but it was a beautiful car out of the box. That's one of the reasons, obviously, that Williams hired Adrian. By then, a lot of people knew how good Adrian was. It wasn't as if he was a sort of secret engineer. And Williams were lucky to get him at the time. But yeah, that car was nothing but grip. And it did seem to be an exponential thing. The faster they went, the more grip they had. It was just different from any other car around at the time, with the exception of the Ferrari to some extent. The Scalabroni engineered Barnard Ferrari was a quick car when it wasn't in trouble with electronics and stuff. That was a quick car as well. As we saw when Nigel Mansell passed Gerhard Berger around the outside of the last corner at Mexico, flat out, just an amazing pass. That was I sent a message actually to, I won't say who, but a friend of mine saying, that pass of Sainz's in China around the outside of Fernando. I mean, that was, when you talk about, I know we're going back to where we were before, but when you talk about, did Lando think about the fact that Lewis Hamilton wasn't going to give him an inch? Think about Carlos Sainz deciding to go around the outside of Fernando Alonso at turn 7. We're talking 100, that's a much quicker corner than turn 1 in terms of the entire corner. You're talking, well, it was 170 on soft tires in qualifying. So you're talking probably 158, 160 miles an hour. And he's around the outside of Fernando. And somebody said, oh, well, he didn't pull it off, did he? Well, he did pull it off. It's just that, as we saw, Fernando got penalized for what he did at turn, 2 corners later.
Yeah.
But it was an unbelievable pass, that. I don't know how we got onto that. Sorry, but
Peter, I love
are we getting on to from Nigel in Mexico? It's a similar thing, similar pass. I thought.
I love going back and delving into the archives. These guys have a different level of cojones, as they say in Spain. Peter, let me ask you a quick question about Adrian Newey, actually, because as I've been reading his book, it seems like the genesis story of Adrian is it's almost like there is no one in the world better equipped to deal with the rules and regs, ground effect era F1 cars than him. Do more with less, right, as far as his emphasis on aerodynamic efficiency, downforce to drag ratio, Leighton House 881, similar story with Williams. Am I right in that, Peter? Is he uniquely equipped, being that, he did his thesis at university on ground effect in sports cars, for Pete's sake, that in 2024 he has a durable competitive advantage, the 10,000 hours that nobody can even compete with, let alone get alongside him, right, as far as his aero knowledge.
Yes, Adrian is unique because he is a specialist aerodynamicist. He's also an extremely good race engineer, car designer, and engine developer, and racing driver, actually, as that happens. Yeah. So tell me somebody else. Colin Chapman is the nearest you can get to Adrian, but he still relied on Frank Costin and Peter Wright for aerodynamic input. Yes, Colin could then extrapolate that input into something very practical and usable, the Lotus 79, but was nonetheless a Peter Wright combination thing with Colin. And before that, it was Frank Costin. So Adrian has had very good people around him and still continues to have very good people around him because he's so good at what he does. He's able to identify the right people to work in all the little cubby holes that he has in which he needs to operate. So that's what makes him so good. And the other point, of course, is that he's worked in a Formula One, which has become increasingly regulated as more time has passed. And that didn't really begin until the back end of Colin Chapman's career in Formula One. As one of the things that drove him out of Formula One, really, was the way the Lotus 88 was legislated out of the sport in 1981. So ever since then, Adrian's been the key man because he's worked in this Formula One of the rule book just growing larger and larger every year. And there aren't many engineers, I think, in the world, let alone automotive or even racing engineers, that could have embraced the increasingly large rule book that Adrian's had to face. And he's faced it by focusing on all the little aerodynamic details that the rule book cannot embrace because they don't know about them. Only he does, and he's found them. So he's continuing to find things that the rule book are not controlling because of his ability to focus on the finest detail of airflow under the car, which is a pretty esoteric thing. And it requires very good use of computer-aided design and CFD, but also a very accurate wind tunnel and not asking of the wind tunnel more than the wind tunnel is able to give you. And yes, Adrian will still go back to his drawing board and he'll still have his pencils and he'll still have his sketchbook and his notebook on the grid. But that'll be just Adrian Newey just ticking over, being Adrian Newey, bubbling up another idea. In terms of execution, everything is done to the minutest detail. And it's, if you brought any engineer from NASA, from aerospace in general, from the automotive industry, and brought them into Adrian Newey's life just for a day, I guarantee they would be blown away.
Peter, I love that, mate. Brilliant stuff. Absolutely incredible. Let me ask you a final question. Peter says, is it an indictment on F1 that Lance Stroll, courtesy of his father's money, still taking up one of 20 seats and making the mistakes that we saw at the Chinese Grand Prix?
It's a very good question. On the one hand, you've got this guy who's, for the second time now, it's probably not the second, it's probably the third, but let's give him the benefit of the doubt, say the second time, he's just driven into a car in front of him at high speed under braking and then blame the guy in front for being an idiot and stopping when Lance didn't want to stop. In this case, Daniel Ricciardo, who I think knows quite a lot about Grand Prix driving, calling him an idiot over the radio. On the other side, you've got this kid who's so obsessed with Formula One and wanting to be successful that he's managed to persuade his father to start up a Formula One team or create a Formula One colossus that is giving jobs to, I don't know how many people, a lot by now. And there's a lot of people making a lot of money and having good lives because of the whole Aston Martin Formula One thing from where it grew, Force India and Racing Point. So it's 6 of one, half a dozen the other, in my mind. You know, if you want this team to exist and for Fernando Alonso to have a decent racing car in the back end of his career and all these people, good people, to have jobs that they deserve to be well paid for, then we've got to accept Lance Stroll. If you want a Formula One where you only have the best drivers on the grid you can possibly have, the 20 best drivers, taking into account the importance of nationalities, as we spoke earlier, then does Lance Stroll belong there? Probably not. So I don't know what is, I'm a purist. You know what my answer is going to be. So I don't need to say. But a lot of people would say, well, you know, Aston Martin's a great team. Fernando's great. We love Fernando. Well, if it wasn't for Lance Stroll, there'd be no Fernando Alonso in Formula One now, probably. He'd probably be doing IndyCar again or World Endurance. So that's where you have to balance your comments about Lance Stroll. But the thing that is perhaps most worrying, if that's the right word, is that when Lance did get into his rant on the radio and did crash into the back of Daniel Ricciardo and ruin Daniel's race as a result, I don't think, I just don't know, but I can't imagine his father afterwards said, Lance, that was the most ridiculous thing you did. That rant on the radio was inexcusable and that was appalling driving. On the contrary, I think he probably said, yeah, you know, what an idiot Ricciardo is, and probably sympathize with his son. And that is the problem, isn't it? But what can we do about that? That's the father-son relationship. And I shouldn't pry into that because it's a personal thing. And I don't know all the secrets of it. What we do know is that the upshot of that relationship is a team that does employ a lot of people and spends, the team itself justifies its existence because it's given us Fernando Alonso. Right. But, you know, where does the buck stop on that whole father-son thing? That's the big question, I guess.
Accountability is a difficult subject topic in F1, particularly when you're dealing with family, right, Peter? It's
well, yeah,
it's a Rubik's cube that you
right.
can't solve.
And it's not only the Aston thing. You got to look at the number of people that have sort of fawned around the whole Stroll thing, from karting, really wanting to be a part of it because there's a lot of money being spent there somewhere, and we want some, we want to be part of the action. money talks in motor racing, and particularly in Formula One. And so long as you're throwing it around, then you're always going to have people around you giving you lots of support.
Tough. Some say that where you were betting degenerate, that your money would be better placed on Lance's future in tennis with the likes of Jocko and Rafa Nadal as versus F1, but I digress.
Well, he'd need to do something about his temper, wouldn't he? I mean, if every time he serves a double fault, he blames the height of the net, then he's not going to make it too far, is he?
Very true, Peter. I love that. He does absolutely need to do something about his temperament. But I digress, Mr. Windsor. Fantastic conversation as always, man. I leave these with a massive smile on my face, Peter. Brilliant stuff each and every single time. If you are listening on a podcasting platform, do yourself a favour and go and check out the Short Corners podcast by my friend and yours, the go-toest F1 mind in the business, Mr. Peter D. Windsor. Superb stuff each and every single time. If you're watching on the YouTubes and you are not subscribed to the Peter D. Windsor channel, then what are you doing with your life? Go on then, quickly, in short order. Go and get over to that and hit the subscribe button. Mr. Windsor, it's been a pleasure as always. If you are listening on a podcasting platform, do me a favour and follow and hit 5 stars. If you're watching on the YouTubes, be sure to like and comment and subscribe. Peter, it's been a pleasure. I've been Cameron F1. And as always, between now and next time, remember to look but never stare.